Summer in a small American town has always been special. The last year of school, the anticipation of graduation, and at the same time, an invisible farewell to childhood. Emma first noticed her heart beating faster when Nick was around. They had known each other since high school, but it was only now that she realized he was more than just a classmate to her. His laughter could always be heard in the school hallway, and during lessons he could wink so slyly that even the strictest teachers couldn't stay angry for long. Tall, with messy dark hair and an easy smile, he always seemed a little removed from all the school hustle and bustle. Graduation night was approaching. It was a grand event in the city, a large hall rented, hundreds of lights, the air filled with laughter and memories. Emma didn't know if Nick would ask her out, and although her friends reassured her, doubts kept nagging at her. He was the guy everyone wanted. Would he pay attention to her? The day before graduation, Nick approached her at her locker. "Hello?" He smiled, a little worried. "Hello?" Emma replied, trying to hide the pounding of her heart. "You don't have a prom date yet, do you?" She nodded and he leaned closer. "Then I have a plan. What do you say?" And it was at that moment that she realized that this was her first love. Sincere, unpredictable, something that would remain in her memory forever. Graduation night had arrived. The large hall was decorated with hundreds of lights, sparkles, and flowers. Laughter was everywhere. Students were dancing, taking pictures, remembering this moment forever. Emma stood in front of the mirror in her room, staring at her reflection. She had chosen a soft blue dress that flowed in waves and high heels that she was not yet used to walking in. Her hair was tied in light curls, and around her neck hung a small pendant, a gift from her mother. The doorbell rings. She quickly went downstairs, and Nick stood on the threshold, in a dark suit, with slightly disheveled hair and the same carefree smile. He held a small white rose in his hands. "This is for you," he said, holding out the flower. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet, but her eyes were shining with joy. The parents took a few photos and they headed to the car. Nick took Emma's hand as they walked outside, and it was a moment she would remember forever, a touch so simple yet so meaningful. At the graduation party, everything was like in a movie: laughter, dancing, music. They spent the evening together, talking, joking, remembering their school years, and then it was time for a slow dance. Nick took her by the waist and she put her hands on his shoulders. They moved to the music and the world around them seemed to dissolve. "I don't want this night to end," she whispered. "It won't end unless we let it," he replied. After graduation, they went to the beach, where all their friends had gathered. The fire of the bonfire illuminated their faces. The waves calmly rolled onto the shore, and the sky was dotted with stars. Nick took Emma's hand and pulled her a little further away from everyone. "Emma," his voice sounded serious, "I don't know what's next, after school, after everything, but I know that I want to spend this summer with you." She smiled. "Me too." And it was then, under the starry sky, that their first kiss happened. Tender, a little unsure, but real. This was love, their first love. And even if it didn't last forever, this night would remain in their hearts forever. Summer passed, leaving behind warm memories of evenings on the beach, long conversations under the stars, and endless walks through the streets of their hometown. But autumn brought changes. Emma received an acceptance letter to Boston University. It was her dream, and she knew she had to go. Nick decided to stay in his hometown, working with his father in a small auto repair shop and saving money for his own business. The day before they left, they sat on the hood of his car by the old water tower, their favorite spot. The breeze played with Emma's hair, and she rested her head on Nick's shoulder, feeling his heart beat fast. "This isn't goodbye, is it?" she asked quietly. "No," he replied, squeezing her fingers in his. "We agreed to wait for each other." "But it will be difficult." "It will, but can't we handle it?" Emma looked into his eyes, acquaintances, relatives, those in whom she always found support. "We can do it," she whispered. He leaned closer and kissed her gently, as if trying to remember this moment forever. She was leaving the next morning. Nick arrived at the bus station holding a small package. "What is this?" she asked, accepting the gift. "You'll open it when you're in Boston." The bus pulled away, and he stood there watching her drive away. Emma couldn't hold back her tears, but she knew they had made a promise to each other. That evening, when she was in her new dorm room, she unwrapped the package. Inside was a silver bracelet with a small, star-shaped pendant. The note to him read, "When it's hard, look at the sky. There will always be the same star we saw together. I'll be waiting for you. Your Nick." Emma clutched the bracelet in her hand and smiled through her tears. They gave each other their word, and they believed that their first love would withstand the test of distance. Autumn in Boston was completely different from their small town. Instead of familiar streets, there were giant buildings. Instead of the smiling faces of friends, there were hundreds of new people, each with their own story. Emma quickly immersed herself in her studies. Lectures, seminars, evenings with new friends. Life spun her in its rhythm. But every night, before falling asleep, she looked out the window at the stars and thought about Nick. They communicated almost every day, messages, video calls, sometimes long letters. One of the first letters from Nick. "Hello, little star. It's kind of empty here without you. The car starts, but driving it isn't that exciting anymore. The workshop is working, my father is happy, but most importantly, I'm waiting. You won't forget me in this big city, will you?" Emma smiled every time she read his message. She hadn't forgotten. She couldn't forget. Several months passed. Winter had set in. She was to return home for Christmas, and her heart pounded with anticipation of the reunion. When her bus pulled up to the station, the first thing she saw was a familiar figure waiting for her. Nick. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking straight at her. "Hello, little star," he said as she ran up to him. "Hello," she smiled, and without holding back, threw herself into his arms. They spent every day together as if making up for lost time, but inside Emma felt anxious. In a few weeks she would have to go back again. One evening, as they sat in his car, Nick sighed and said, "I thought, maybe I'll come to you in the spring, see your city, your university." Emma looked at him hopefully. "Are you really going to do this?" "I promise to wait, and I will wait, but that doesn't mean we can't find a way to be closer." She squeezed his hand and realized that their first love was being tested by distance. But it didn't weaken. On the contrary, it only grew stronger. Emma returned to school in Boston. One evening, its classmate Claire invited her to her birthday party, was in a large house outside the city, and although Emma first doubted whether worth to go, Claire insisted. "You need to relax a bit, enough with studying and calling home," she encouraged. And now she was standing in a room where loud music was playing. Laughter was heard, and everyone seemed carefree. There she met Eric, Claire's older brother. He was studying at another university and had come for the weekend. Tall, confident, with that easy charisma that makes people listen. At first they just talked about Boston, her hometown, how hard it was to study, then there were cocktails. "Another one?" he asked, pouring her a glass. She knew she had had enough, but at that moment everything seemed so far away. Her small town, Nick, the promises. She laughed, danced, allowed herself more than she was used to. When they were alone in Claire's bedroom, she stopped thinking. All she could feel was his hands, his lips, his breath on her skin. Emma woke to the bright morning light streaming through the curtains. Her head was a little buzzing, her mouth was dry, and her heart was beating faster than usual. She slowly opened her eyes and saw that she was lying in the wrong room. Eric slept peacefully on the pillow next to her. His breathing was even. He looked so carefree. But inside Emma, everything tightened. A wave of realization washed over her. What did I do? She sat up carefully on the bed, her arms around herself. Everything that had happened last night flashed through her mind in fragments. The laughter, the looks, the dancing, his touches. It was easy, natural, but at the same time, it was wrong. She felt bad for herself. Nick's face immediately appeared in her mind, his smile, his warm voice, the bracelet she wore on her wrist as a symbol of their promise. She couldn't stay here any longer. Quietly, so as not to wake Eric, Emma got up, quickly gathered her things, and left the room. She walked down the hall to the kitchen, where Claire was already sitting with a cup of coffee. "Oh, hello," she raised her eyebrows at Emma. "You didn't stay long, I see." Emma forced herself to smile, even though everything inside was crumbling. "Yes, I have to go." She quickly left the house, breathing in the cold morning air. But even that couldn't wash away the guilt that was beginning to weigh on her chest. She wanted to turn back time, but it was already too late. Emma walked through the empty streets, feeling anxiety tighten in her chest. What now? How to live with this? She reached her dorm room, closed the door, and leaned her back against it. Her mind reeled with memories of the previous night, her heart filled with despair. The phone vibrated. Nick. "Good morning, Star. How are you? I fell asleep early yesterday, didn't answer. I'm fine. I have a lot of work today, but I'm thinking about you. I miss you. See you soon." These words, so simple and warm, pierced her to the bone. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. She reached for the bracelet that was still on her wrist. How could she? How could she so easily cross out what they were building? She wanted to call him, tell him everything. But was it worth it? Would he be able to forgive her? She sat in the room for hours, not knowing what to do. Claire wrote a message. Claire. "Hey, how are you? Don't feel bad, it happens. It's just a party." Just a party? For Emma, it wasn't just. The day passed in thought. She avoided everyone, didn't leave her room, didn't even respond to Nick's messages. And then a video call rang out. His face appeared on the screen, familiar, smiling. "Hello, my love," he said, and something in her heart turned. She had to make a choice, tell the truth, or leave everything as it is. Emma took a deep breath, staring at the screen. Nick was smiling, his eyes shining with joy, and in that moment she knew she couldn't tell him. She didn't want to lose him. "Hello," she replied, forcing herself to smile. "You disappeared somewhere yesterday, I was worried," he said. "Oh, sorry. It was just, I have a lot of things to do, and I'm a little tired." Quickly she replied, trying to speak calmly. Nick nodded. "The main thing is that you are okay. I am so looking forward to spring. I want to see you, hug you." These words pierced her to the depths of her soul. She felt a lump in her throat, but she forced herself to swallow it. "I'm waiting too," she whispered. They talked for another 10 minutes, about his work, about her studies, about plans for a meeting. He, as always, was warm, familiar, faithful, and she was silent. When the call ended, Emma fell onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. Just forget it. She repeated it to herself over and over again. It was a mistake. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change the fact that I love Nick. But inside, a shadow still remained. She knew that this night would stay with her forever. And even though she decided not to talk about it, it didn't mean it would cease to exist. Weeks passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Studying, calling Nick, meeting friends, everything seemed as if nothing had happened. But over time, Emma began to notice something strange. First, it was fatigue. She would wake up exhausted, even after a full night's sleep. Then came nausea, which would come on suddenly, especially in the morning. At first, she thought it was stress or a poor diet, but when one morning the smell of coffee made her nauseous, she knew something was wrong. Somewhere deep down, she already knew what was happening, but was afraid to admit it. That same day, when she was left alone in the dormitory, she walked to the nearest pharmacy. The walk there seemed endless. It seemed to her that everyone was looking at her, that everyone knew why she was there. When she finally stood in the bathroom holding the test in her hands, her fingers were shaking. A minute of waiting seemed like an eternity. One strip, and one more. 2. The world before her eyes swam, and she slowly sank to the floor. This can't be... But it was. She's pregnant, and she knew it wasn't from Nick. Emma sat on the cold bathroom floor, staring at the test, clutched tightly in her hand. The 2 clear lines stood out so brightly as if they were screaming her secret. Her thoughts were chaotic. Her heart was pounding. What now? What should I do? Her first thought was to call Nick. He had always been her support, someone who understood and supported her. But how could she tell him about this? The second call she considered was to Eric. She remembered his smile, the moments they had spent together, and felt despair wash over her. In the evening, when the room was plunged into darkness, she sat by the window, staring at the distant lights of the city. Her hand involuntarily reached for the bracelet on her wrist, a symbol of her promise to Nick. How could I have messed up so much? The next day, she decided to meet Claire. They were sitting in a small cafe, and after a few moments of awkward silence, Emma confessed. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, clutching her coffee cup so tightly that she thought it would break. Claire's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Emma nodded, feeling the wave of tears roll in again. "Is this from Eric?" "Yes." Claire sighed, took her hand. Have you spoken to him yet? No, I don't even know what to say and what to do. Claire thought about it. Emma, this is hard, very hard, but you don't have to go through this alone. We'll figure it out together. Emma nodded, but inside she felt that no words could change what had happened. Later that day, she plucked up the courage to text Eric. We need to talk. This is important. The answer came almost instantly. Sure, let's meet tonight. Evening had fallen on the city when they met in the same cafe. Eric had looked calm, even a little carefree, but when she told him the truth, his face changed. Pregnant? He repeated the word, as if digesting its meaning. Yes, her voice trembled, and this is from you, Eric thought, rubbing his chin. I didn't expect this, he admitted. But what do you want to do? Emma was silent because she didn't know the answer. She was lost, scared, and full of guilt. Her first love, the promises she and Nick had made to each other, all of that was now in jeopardy because of one night, one mistake. Eric looked at her seriously. He was silent for a moment, as if considering everything, and then, unexpectedly for her, he said, Emma, let's get married. She froze, not believing what she heard. What? She asked, as if not understanding the meaning of his words. Eric sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You're pregnant by me. I'm not some irresponsible guy who's just going to pretend nothing happened. I like you. You're special. And if it's my child, I want to be there. Emma felt panic tighten in her chest. But we don't even know each other that well. She shrugged, trying to digest his words. That's true, he nodded. But I know you're a good, smart, and incredible girl. I saw that night. I'm not saying we have to get married tomorrow, but maybe it's the best decision? She lowered her eyes. This is all happening too fast. 100 questions raced through her mind. What about Nick? What would she say to him? Would she be able to say anything at all? Emma looked up at Eric. He didn't look scared or confused. On the contrary, there was something firm, determined in his gaze. Just think about it, he said softly. I'm not going to pressure you, but I want to be a part of it. Emma nodded. Good, I will think. But she knew that a very difficult choice awaited her. Emma sat in her room, staring at her phone. She had been swiping her finger across the screen for several minutes, but she didn't dare press the call button. How could she tell her parents? How could she explain that she, their daughter, who had always been responsible and sensible, was now pregnant and about to get married? Sighing, she finally pressed call. Hello, Mom. Emma, hello, dear. How are you? How are your studies? There was genuine joy in her mother's voice. Emma swallowed. Mom, there's something important I want to talk about. What happened? Her tone changed immediately. I'm pregnant, she said, and the phone fell silent. Nothing was heard for several seconds. What? The mother finally said. I'm pregnant, Emma repeated quietly, feeling her hands begin to shake. Oh, God. His mother's voice was drowned out by the distant noise. How did this happen? No, wait, from whom? From a guy, Emma replied, not knowing how to explain it any easier. Nick? No, another one. His name is Eric. Emma! Her mother's voice was now more desperate. What have you done? What about Nick? Mom, I know it's complicated, but Eric wants to take responsibility. He proposed marriage. Marry? Now the father, who seemed to be standing nearby, could also be heard. You don't even know him well. I know, but that's right. Is that right? Honey, you're still so young. You just entered university. The mother was in despair. I've thought it over, Mom. I can't change what happened, but I can make the right choice now. Silence fell again. When do you plan to come home? My father finally asked. Soon. Eric and I will arrive together. We need to talk about this, her mother said, her voice quieter but no less concerned. Emma, we love you, but we want you to make a choice that won't ruin your life. I want it too, Mom, she whispered. When the call ended, Emma collapsed onto her pillow, closing her eyes. She knew this was just the beginning of a difficult journey, but there was no turning back. The wedding was organized quickly. It wasn't the big romantic celebration Emma had dreamed of as a child, but she convinced herself that the main thing was to make the right choice for her unborn child. Eric took on most of the responsibilities. He talked to her parents, invited guests, organized. He was calm and confident, and that gave Emma a sense of stability, even if deep down she wasn't sure about her feelings. The ceremony took place in a small wedding hall in Boston. Only the closest people were there: parents, Claire, a few friends. Nick, of course, was not there. Emma stood in front of the mirror in a simple but beautiful white dress. She stared at her reflection and tried to figure out what she was feeling. Joy? Excitement? Or fear? "Ready?" Claire asked quietly, peering into the room. Emma took a breath and nodded. When she entered the hall, Eric was already waiting. He smiled at her and took her hand. "Everything will be fine," he whispered. The ceremony was short. "Do you agree, Emma, to take Eric as your husband?" She looked at him, at his eyes that radiated confidence. "Yes," she replied. Their announced husband and wife. All applauded, parents hugged them, and Emma, I felt a strange, heavy feeling growing in my chest. Feeling... She looked back at the door. If the circumstances were different, if it were Nick. But she didn't let herself think about it. This day she became Eric's wife, and now she will have to live with that choice. Nick found out about the wedding by chance. Emma never dared tell him the truth. He didn't suspect anything. He and Emma were still texting, although lately she had been responding less and less. He blamed it on studying, on fatigue, on the distance. But then, one day a friend from their town wrote to him, "Do you already know that Emma got married?" He felt cold. His heart seemed to stop for a second. What? He couldn't believe his eyes. "Yeah, her parents say she got married in Boston. Apparently she was pregnant and decided to marry some guy." Nick clenched the phone in his hand. "Is she married?" She didn't even tell him. She just disappeared, just left him in the dark while she built a new life with someone else. Thoughts raced through his head. He couldn't figure out what hurt more, the fact that she was betraying him or the fact that she didn't have the courage to tell the truth. He wanted to call her. He wanted to hear her voice, to ask why. But he didn't. Instead, he just got in the car and drove far away from the city, not knowing what to do with all this pain that was tearing him apart from the inside. Nick raced down the empty highway, gripping the steering wheel tightly. One thought kept running through his head. How could she? He took out his phone, scrolling through old messages from Emma. She had written to him that she missed him, that she was looking forward to their meeting, that she loved him. And now it turned out that all this time she had been preparing for her wedding to someone else. Anger mixed with pain. He stopped the car at a roadside cafe and got out, breathing in the cold air. He needed to calm down. He didn't want to believe it was all true, but if she really was pregnant, then it definitely wasn't his child. He picked up the phone again, opened her contact. "Emma." My finger hovered over the call button. He pressed. The beep, another one. "Hello." Her voice sounded quiet, anxious. Nick was silent for a few seconds, trying to contain his emotions. "Is that true?" Emma didn't answer right away. "Nick, I wanted to tell you." "Did you want to?" His voice trembled with suppressed anger. "You got married, and I'm going to find out about it from others?" There was silence in the receiver. "I'm sorry," her voice broke. "Excuse me?" He laughed bitterly. "Is that all you can say?" I didn't know how. "How can I lie? How can I hide the fact that you're carrying someone else's child?" He clenched his fist. "I would understand, Emma, but you didn't even give me a chance." "Nick, please." "There's no please," he interrupted. "We gave each other our word. Do you remember? We were supposed to be together. We were supposed to wait. I didn't want this to happen. But it happened," he breathed out sharply. "I hope you're happy, Emma." He pressed end call before she could say anything. And only when silence filled the space around him again did he realize that he would never hear her voice again the way he had before. Married life turned out to be nothing like in the movies. At first, everything seemed new, unusual. Eric tried to be attentive, supported her, said that they would cope. They chose children's things together, planned the future. But over time, Emma began to feel that this marriage was not about love, but about a responsibility that they both took on due to circumstances. They lived in a small apartment in Boston, which they rented near the university. She went to classes during the day, and in the evenings, she sat at home, preparing lectures and thinking about the future. Eric worked and often came home late. They talked about the child, about everyday things, but there was no passion, no warmth between them that is found in real couples. One day, as she stood in front of the mirror, Holding her already noticeably rounded belly, she felt something inside her tighten painfully. She remembered how she dreamed of this moment, when she would be expecting a child from Nick, when they would plan a future together, be happy. But now everything was different. Eric noticed that she was detached. "Are you okay?" he asked one evening, sitting down next to me. "Yes," she lied, not even looking at him. "Emma, if something's wrong." "It's okay," she interrupted, forcing herself to smile. But that was not true. Every day she felt more and more that their marriage was just a formality. They both tried to do everything right, but there was no real feeling in it. And the more she tried to silence her thoughts, the more emptiness she felt in her heart. One night she woke up in the middle of the night and looked at Eric sleeping peacefully next to her. She realized that he was a good man, trying to give her the best. But he wasn't Nick. And that was her greatest pain. Time passed quickly, and then the day arrived that would change her life forever. Emma lay in the hospital room, clutching Eric's hand. The pain came in waves, but at that moment she thought of only one thing. She would see her daughter very soon. "You're strong, Emma. You'll make it," Eric whispered, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She screamed for what seemed like an eternity. But then, cry, their baby's first cry. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the doctor gently placed the little body on her chest. She looked at the tiny face, the little fingers that pinched her skin, and her heart filled with warmth. "She's beautiful," Eric whispered, gently touching his daughter's head. Emma smiled through her tears. "Hello, my little one." She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how her life would turn out. But in that moment, holding her daughter, she realized one thing. This little girl was her greatest meaning. And even if in her a shadow lived in the heart past, she will do everything to its daughter was happy. Years passed and life gradually became stable. Emma graduated with honors from university and was soon offered a job at a prestigious company in Boston. She was hesitant for a long time, as it meant even more time away from home. But Eric convinced her, "You deserve it, Emma. I always knew you would succeed." He was right. She worked hard despite the difficulties. Over time, their financial situation improved, and they were able to afford to hire a nanny for their daughter, Sophia. This made life easier. Emma could devote more time to work, while Eric continued to work on his business. However, despite all her successes, her heart did not feel true peace. She loved her daughter immensely, but something remained unfinished in her relationship with Eric. They became more like life partners than a couple in love. There were dinners together, conversations about the child, plans for the future. All this was there, but there was no warm fire between them, which should once have been in a real family. Sometimes when Sophia fell asleep and Eric worked late, Emma would sit on the couch scrolling through her phone. Her hand always reached for the contact she never removed. Nick. She never called him again. But every night she asked herself, what if things had been different? One evening, when Emma sat at her laptop working on another report, electronically mail, the invitation came. Alumni reunion 20 years later. We are waiting for everyone at our home school. Come remember old times, see friends, and just have a good time. She reread the letter several times. 20 years. Has it really been that long? Memories flashed through his mind. Prom night, the promises they made to each other, that summer before they left, and how it all went wrong. "What is this?" Eric asked, walking past and glancing at the screen. "An invitation to the alumni reunion," she replied, not taking her eyes off the message. He stopped. "You're not going to leave, are you?" She turned her head. "Why not?" "Emma, it's been 20 years. Why do you need this?" "Because it's part of my life." "We're busy. You have work. I have work. Sophia is studying for exams right now. She needs you," he said, shrugging. "She's a grown-up," Emma objected, "and it's just for the weekend." Eric looked at her carefully. Is it because of him? She knew who he was talking about, but pretended not to understand. "Through whom?" "Because of Nick," he said bluntly. She was silent for a second, not knowing what to say. "I just want to see old friends." Eric came closer and leaned on the table. "That's the past, Emma, a past that's long gone." She took a breath, trying to stay calm. "I know, but it's a part of me, Eric. I want to go." He looked at her for a moment longer, then stepped back. "Do as you know." His voice was cold, and she knew he wasn't happy about it, but it was her decision. The next day, she started packing. As she was packing the dress into her suitcase, she stopped and ran her fingers thoughtfully over the fabric. What will it be like to go back to where it all began? She closed it, suitcase, took a ticket, and left. When Emma arrived in her hometown, it felt like she had stepped back in time. Everything was almost the same as it had been 20 years ago. The same streets, the same houses, even some of the shop windows had remained unchanged. She first went to her parents' house. Her mother met her at the door, giving her a big hug. "Oh, you're finally home," she said, stepping back and looking at her daughter. "You've changed so much, but your eyes are the same." "Mom, I'm just here for the weekend," Emma smiled as she walked inside. I know, but how long has it been since you were last here?" "A few years ago." "That's right." His father joined in, leaving the living room. "And now look, we have your favorite pie." The evening passed in warm conversation. They talked about Sophia, about work, about Boston, but not a word about Eric or her marriage. Her mother watched her carefully, as if trying to understand what was going on in her heart. "You've changed," she said quietly when they were alone in the kitchen. "Everyone changes, Mom. It's been 20 years. But you've become—" She hesitated a little. "Like you're less happy." Emma looked down at the cup of tea in front of her. "It's okay, Mom." Mother sighed but said nothing more. Emma woke up early the next morning, feeling a little anxious, and she couldn't tell if it was from the excitement of the meeting or the memories that were flooding back. She put on an elegant but simple dress, applied light makeup, and looked at herself in the mirror. 20 years. She took her handbag, said goodbye to her parents, and headed to school. When she entered the familiar assembly hall, she heard laughter, voices that had once been a part of her life. And among all these people, her eyes immediately found him. Nick. He was standing at the table talking to one of his classmates. And then he turned his head and their eyes met. Everything around seemed to have disappeared. He approached slowly. "Emma." "Hello, Nick." Her voice was quiet, almost trembling. 20 years. And here they were standing face to face again. Nick stood before her, and for a few seconds, it seemed as if time had rewound. He had changed. His hair had turned a little gray at the temples, his features had become more mature, but his eyes remained the same as they had been the day she had last spoken to him on the phone. "You haven't changed at all," he said with a slight smile. Emma smiled back. "Oh, I've changed a lot, Nick. It's been 20 years. "Yes," he nodded, "but I still recognized you at first sight." Her heart skipped a beat. She wanted to say something ordinary, but the words wouldn't come. "How are you?" she asked finally. "Everything's fine," he replied. "After school, I worked here, opened my own business. I had a family." She felt a tightness inside her. "Was it?" Nick sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I got divorced 3 years ago. Everything just stopped working. I guess we just weren't meant for each other." She nodded, not knowing what to say. "And you?" he asked, looking closely at her face. "I live in Boston. I graduated from university. I work. I have a daughter." Nick smiled. "I know." She looked at him in surprise. "From where?" "It's a small town, Emma. Rumors spread quickly." She nodded, smiling. "And your husband?" he asked. She felt something tighten in her chest. "Eric. He's good. We've been through a lot." Nick looked at her for a long time, as if trying to figure out why she wasn't finishing. "But are you happy?" This question caught her off guard. She wanted to say yes right away, but something held her back. I live my life the way it should be," she replied evasively. Nick nodded, as if he understood everything without words. There was laughter all around, people reminiscing about the past, and they stood side by side, two people who were once supposed to be together. But life had decreed otherwise. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally. "Me too," she whispered. But there was a question hanging in the air that they didn't dare voice. What if things were different? The music played softly, filling the hall with nostalgic melodies from the past. The voices of old friends, laughter, the clinking of glasses. All this created an atmosphere as if they had returned to those school years. Emma and Nick stood side by side for a long time, talking, remembering the moments of their youth that still seemed so close. They talked about everything. About school, about friends, about the lives that had taken them in different directions. But both felt that there was something more, something indescribable between them, coming to life again. As the slow melody began, Nick suddenly held out his hand to her. "Shall we dance?" She looked at him and her heart beat faster. "Like in the old days?" "Exactly," he smiled. Emma hesitated for just a second, then put her hand in his. He gently pulled her closer, and they began to move to the music. Her head barely touched his shoulder, and his hands were warm, familiar, as if no time had passed at all. "Do you remember our graduation?" he asked quietly. "How could I forget?" she whispered back. "I thought then that we would have a different future." Emma didn't answer. She didn't want to think about what might have been. She just wanted to enjoy the moment. They danced all evening. They didn't need words. Everything was clear without them. And with every minute, with every touch, with every look, everything they once felt for each other came back. It was inevitable. They were again who they had been 20 years ago. After the alumni reunion, they didn't want to part. The night was warm. The air was full of the aroma of their old hometown. They left the school hall together, and although they both knew it could be dangerous, for their current lives, for their hearts, they couldn't stop. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, looking at Nick. "Let's just take a walk like we used to." He smiled, stuffing his hands in his pockets. The streets were empty. Only a few streetlights cast a yellowish light on the sidewalks. They walked slowly, as if nothing had changed in the 20 years. "Do you remember our place?" Nick asked after a few minutes of silence. Emma nodded. "Water Tower. Shall we go there?" She nodded again, and they turned into a familiar alley. When they climbed the hill, a view of the city opened up before them. Small, cozy, so familiar. Here they spent countless evenings at school. Here they shared their dreams. Emma sat on the hood of his car, as she used to do. "It's like going back in time," she said, looking up at the night sky. "Maybe it is?" Nick leaned close, his gaze fixed directly on her. She felt her heart start beating faster again. "Have you ever thought about us?" Nick didn't answer right away. "I didn't just think, I lived with these thoughts for a long time." She lowered her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Nick." He sighed softly. "I know." She turned her head to him and their eyes met. "Are you happy now?" "I would have been happier if you had been around all these years," he admitted. Emma felt something turn inside her chest. "Do you still feel something for me?" Nick smiled and, without looking away, took her hand. "And you?" Her heart told her the answer, but she was afraid to say it out loud. But he already knew. And then he leaned closer. Her eyes closed involuntarily. And at that moment, when their lips barely touched each other, she realized they never stopped loving each other. Their lips touched for only a moment, but it was enough to ignite that same long-forgotten feeling in her chest. Emma suddenly flinched as if she had been burned. "Nick," her voice was almost a whisper. He didn't let go of her hand. He just looked at her the way he had once looked at her in those distant years when they were still teenagers. "You feel it, just like I do," he said calmly. She wanted to deny it, to say that everything had changed, that she couldn't. But she couldn't, because it was true. "I'm married," she finally breathed out. Nick pursed his lips, looked away, but then looked back at her. "Are you happy?" This wasn't the first time she'd heard that question. But this time it was harder to answer because he was holding her hand, and she knew that if she said yes, it would be a lie. Her voice broke. He squeezed her fingers lightly. "Emma, tell the truth." She took a deeper breath, lowered her eyes. "I live as it should be." That's not an answer. She wanted to cry. "Nick, this is difficult." "What's difficult?" He didn't let go of her hand. "That you still love me?" Her gaze met his sharply. She couldn't deny it. "I thought I could forget you," he said quietly, "but I couldn't." She knew he was sincere. Distance, years, different destinies, all of that was there, but the feelings, they never disappeared. "Do you remember our promise?" he asked. Her eyes filled with tears. "We promised to wait for each other," she whispered. Nick ran his fingers along her cheek. "Maybe we're just late?" She didn't know what to say. "I don't know what to do." Her voice broke. He ran his thumb along her hand. "We've lost each other before. I can't go through it again." Emma felt something break in her heart. She will have to make a choice, but what choice? After that night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed in her parents' house, staring at the ceiling, feeling something in her heart change forever. She didn't want to go back to Boston. I didn't want to go back to Eric. Her thoughts were confused, but she knew one thing for sure. From the moment she met Nick again, her life could no longer remain the same as before. In the morning, she was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee when her mother came up to her. "You look different," she said, studying her face carefully. Emma looked down. "I can't go back, Mom." Mother put the kettle on and sat down opposite her. "Because of Nick?" Emma nodded, clutching the cup in her hands. "I thought I had learned to live without him, but now I realize that all these years I was just forcing myself to believe it." Mother sighed. "You love him, right?" Emma smiled through her tears. "I never stopped." Mother took her hand. "You know it won't be easy." "I know. And Eric." Emma closed her eyes. "He's good, but I don't love him." "And what are you going to do?" She took a deep breath and looked at her mother with a determined look. "I'll tell him the truth." Conversation with Eric. Emma returned to Boston the next day. She didn't drag out the conversation. It wasn't fair to her or him. Eric was sitting in the living room when she walked into the apartment. He saw the look on her face and knew immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" Emma sat down opposite him, took a breath. "Eric, I can't pretend anymore." He frowned. "Pretend?" "I can't go back to this life. I can't be with you." Silence fell. He stared at her for a few seconds, then leaned back on the sofa and ran his hand over his face. "Is it because of him?" She didn't lie. "Yes." He sighed, looked at her for a long time, and then smiled bitterly. "I always knew I wasn't your first choice." Emma lowered her head. "Sorry. Why didn't you just tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted to do the right thing. I wanted Sophia to have a family." "But it wasn't a real family, was it?" She was silent. He sighed again. "You've already decided, right?" "Yes." Eric nodded. "Then go." She paused for a second, looking at him. Emma was driving back to her hometown, and for the first time in a long time, her heart was beating not with anxiety, but with a sense of freedom. She was no longer going to run away from her feelings. Her hands were shaking a little as she stopped outside the workshop Nick had opened. She didn't know how he would react, but she knew she had to do it. She got out of the car, took a deep breath, and went inside. Nick was standing by the car, wiping his hands of oil when he saw her. He froze. "Emma?" She smiled, feeling her eyes fill with tears. "Hello, Nick." He stepped closer as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing her here. "What are you doing here?" She took a deeper breath and said the words she had been holding in her mind all this time. "I don't want to get divorced anymore." His eyes widened, and then they took on that familiar sparkle she remembered from her youth. "Are you sure?" "For the first time in years, I'm sure," she whispered. He took a step forward, gently touching her face, as if afraid it was a dream. "You're not going anymore?" "Never." And at that moment, he pulled her to him, and she finally felt again what true happiness was. She didn't know what lay ahead for them, but she knew one thing. This time she wouldn't let them lose each other again. Emma knew she would have to talk to Sophia. She couldn't just start a new life without explaining everything to her daughter. A few days after moving in, she decided to dial her number. She was nervously clutching the phone in her hands when she heard a familiar voice. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, dear. How are you?" "It's okay." The voice was cold, distant. "What happened?" Emma took a deep breath. "Son, we need to talk." "I already know," Sophia interrupted her. "Dad told me." Emma froze for a second. "And what did he say?" "That you left us for some man from the past." Emma's heart clenched painfully. "Sophie, that's not true. I didn't leave you. I just realized I couldn't live a lie anymore." "Lies?" Sophia asked sharply. "So our life was a lie? The fact that you and Dad raised me together, was it all a lie?" "No, no," Emma replied hastily. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me. But I couldn't pretend to be happy anymore." "And Dad? His happiness doesn't matter? Mine doesn't matter?" "You will always be the most important thing to me." Emma's voice trembled. "But I also have the right to be happy." Silence fell. "I don't want to see you, Mom." Emma felt her hands tremble. "Sophie, please!" "No, Mom, you made your choice. Now let me make mine." "Horns!" She disconnected. Emma was left sitting with the phone in her hands, feeling her heart break. She knew this path would not be easy. She knew she would have to win her daughter's trust again, but she won't give it up. Nick sat down next to her and silently hugged her. "She's angry now," he said quietly, "but she'll understand in time." Emma closed her eyes, giving herself a second of weakness, allowing herself to cry. "I'm afraid I've lost her forever. You are her mother, Emma. She may not speak to you now, but she loves you, and one day she will come to you herself." Emma wanted to believe it. But what if Sophia really will never forgive her? Days passed, but Sophia still didn't get in touch. Emma texted her, tried calling her, but there was no answer. She understood that her daughter felt betrayed, that she needed time, but every silence from her side hurt. Nick was there, supporting her, but he also saw how hard it was for her. One day, as she sat on the porch of their new house in her hometown, her phone vibrated. It was a text message from Sophia. "Sophia, I'll come on Saturday. Not to make up. I just want to hear everything from you personally." Emma froze, rereading the words several times. She didn't know what she felt. Joy that her daughter finally wanted to see her, or fear that this conversation could permanently destroy their relationship. Nick noticed her expression. "What happened?" "Sophia will be coming on Saturday," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Nick nodded. "That's good." "She said it wasn't to make up," Emma added, looking at him with pain in her eyes. "She just wants to understand," he replied calmly. "That's something." Emma nodded, though she was shaking inside. Saturday, meeting with Sophia. Emma was standing by the window when she saw a familiar car pull up in front of the house. Her heart was beating wildly. Sophia got out of the car, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and walked resolutely to the door. She had changed, no longer the little girl Emma remembered. She was a grown, confident young woman. She knocked, even though the door was open. Emma took a deep breath and opened it. "Hello," she said quietly. "Hello," Sophia replied without emotion. She entered the house and went into the living room. Nick didn't want to interfere and left them alone. Sophia sat on the sofa, folded her arms across her chest, and looked at her mother. "Okay, I'm here. So tell me, why the hell did you decide to destroy our family?" Emma closed her eyes and sighed. "Sophie, I know you're angry right now, and you have every right to be—" "Am I angry?" She laughed bitterly. "You went to another man. Just like that, you left Dad and me." "It wasn't just like that," Emma replied calmly. "I lived for many years the way I had to, and not the way I wanted to." Sophia pursed her lips. "And were you thinking about me?" "Always." "Then why didn't you stay?" Emma came closer and sat down opposite her daughter. "Because living without love is not life, Sophie." Sophia shrugged. "Dad loved you." "I know, but I didn't love him as much as I should have." Sophia was silent. "You're still young, Sophie, and it may be hard for you to understand now," Emma said gently, "but one day you'll meet someone you can't breathe without. I met her 20 years ago." Sophia shook her head. "So what? Does that justify everything?" "No, I know I hurt you, but I couldn't live a lie anymore." Sophia thought for a moment, then asked sharply, "Are you happy now?" Emma was momentarily surprised by the question. "Yes," she answered honestly. Sophia was silent for a moment, then sighed heavily. "I don't know if I can forgive you now." "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away," Emma said. "I'm just asking you not to cut me out of your life." Sophia looked at her and then, without saying a word, stood up. "I need to think," she said, and headed for the door. "Sophie," Emma called her. The daughter stopped but did not turn back. "I'll always be there, no matter when you're ready to talk." Sophia nodded and left. Emma watched after her, feeling heavy in her chest, but relieved at the same time. It was not an easy step, but it was taken, and she believed one day Sophia will return to her. Sophia drove back to Boston, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment, of anger, but at the same time, something deep inside her told her that her mother was telling the truth. She raced down the track, trying to suppress the emotions bubbling up inside. The rain had just started, the drops hitting the windshield, forcing her to slow down a bit. Suddenly, a car in front of her suddenly braked. Sophia instinctively slammed on the brakes, but the wet road did its job. The wheels lost traction, and the car began to skid. It all happened in a matter of seconds. A sharp blow, a screech of metal, and then darkness. Phone call. Emma was cooking dinner when her phone rang. She didn't even look at the screen, she just picked up the phone. "Hello?" Is this Emma Weston? An unfamiliar male voice made her wary. Yes, who is it? This is St. Thomas's Hospital in Boston. Your daughter, Sophia Weston, has been in a car accident. Her heart seemed to stop. What? How is she? Is she alive? She's alive, but in critical condition. We need you to come as soon as possible. The phone fell from her hands. She felt her legs go numb and the world around her spin. Emma? Nick ran over to her, noticing that she was as pale as chalk. What happened? She raised her frightened eyes to him. Sophia, accident. She's in the hospital. Nick didn't ask questions. I'm going with you. They dropped everything and set off, knowing only one thing. Sophia was fighting for her life, and she needed her mother. Emma and Nick sped along the highway, silently staring at the dark road ahead. The rain had almost stopped, but its tracks still lingered on the asphalt, a reminder of how easily one can lose control. Emma couldn't gather her thoughts. Her fingers clenched the phone, and the doctor's voice kept repeating in her head. Critical condition. She tried to breathe, but with each new kilometer, she only got worse. She's strong, Nick finally spoke. She'll make it. Emma looked at him. What if I don't? What if I lost her because of my choice? Don't say that. His voice was firm but gentle. This isn't your fault. But she was angry. She left upset. I could see it in her eyes. Emma wiped a tear that rolled down her cheek. I couldn't stand it if something happened to her. She's your daughter, Nick said, which means she's as strong as you. She gratefully squeezed his hand, finding support in his presence for a second. Hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, they were met by a doctor in a white coat, his face serious. Are you Sophia Weston's mother? Yes, how is she? She suffered serious injuries, 2 broken ribs, a severe concussion, and... The doctor paused. She's in a coma. Emma felt her legs give way. No, not that... Nick picked her up, helping her stay upright. She's alive. Her condition is stable, but we can't say when she'll regain consciousness. The doctor looked at them sympathetically. Can I see her? Emma barely managed to say. Yes, but not for long. They walked down a long corridor, and when Emma entered the ward, her heart broke. Sophia lay in a hospital bed, covered in tubes and sensors. Her pale face, always so expressive, was now calm, almost lifeless. Emma carefully sat down next to her, took her cold hand in hers. Daughter, her voice broke. Nick stood silently by, letting her speak. Please come back to me. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I love you. I always have. Her tears dripped onto Sophia's hand, but she didn't move. Only the steady beeping of the machines filled the room. Emma squeezed her hand even tighter. I won't leave you. No matter how long it takes you, I'll be here. She didn't know how long it would be before Sophia opened her eyes again. But she wasn't going to give up on her daughter. The days in the hospital stretched out into infinity. Emma never left Sophia's bedside, holding her hand and telling her everything. Her life, their shared memories, even her fears. She believed that her daughter could hear her, that somewhere out there in the depths of her unconscious, Sophia was fighting to return to her. Nick supported her, brought her food, made her rest for at least a few hours, but Emma couldn't stay away from Sophia for long. A week has passed. Sophia still lay motionless, her chest rising and falling steadily, thanks to the machines that helped her breathe. One evening, when Nick fell asleep in the chair next to him, Emma, as usual, sat next to her daughter, squeezing her fingers. Sonny, she whispered, if you can hear me, please give me a sign. Silence. Emma wiped away the tears that had welled up in her eyes. I know you're mad at me. I know I hurt you and your dad, but I never wanted to lose you. She took a deep breath. You have always been the most important thing to me, and I will do everything to prove it to you. Just please wake up. And suddenly, did she think Sophia's fingers were barely moving? Emma held her breath, leaned closer. Sophie? Something had changed in her face, a barely noticeable movement of her eyelids. Nick, she whispered, quickly waking him up. He jumped up and looked at Sophia, who, albeit slowly, was trying to open her eyes. Sophie, can you hear me? It's Mom. Her eyelids twitched again, and after a few seconds she opened her eyes. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, unable to believe her eyes. Mom! Sophia's voice was weak, but it was a real word. Oh, God! Tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm here, honey, I'm here! Nick left the room calling for the doctor, and Emma still held her daughter's hand, stroking her hair and whispering words of love to her. Sophia was exhausted, but her eyes looked at her mother with an inexplicable mixture of feelings. "You didn't. You left." Emma shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Never." She knew they would still have a lot to talk about, that the pain wouldn't go away instantly, but it didn't matter right now. Sophia turned to her, and this was the most important thing. The news of the accident quickly reached Eric. He couldn't believe that Sophia had been hospitalized, and without wasting any time, he immediately went there. When he entered the hallway, he saw a familiar back. Nick was standing at the door of the ward, talking to the doctor. His eyes narrowed with anger. Eric walked quickly, confidently, until he stopped right in front of Nick. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold, but there was anger in it. Nick slowly turned around, looked him straight in the eye. "I support Emma." "Do you support it?" Eric's voice grew louder. "It's all because of you that this happened." Nick frowned. "What are you carrying?" "She left your house of evil and broken. If it weren't for you, she wouldn't have run away like that." Nick took a step closer, his jaws tightening. "Listen, I understand that you're hurting, but that's no reason to take your anger out on me." "This isn't just anger," Eric said through gritted teeth. "You took my wife away from me, and now you're interfering in my daughter's life?" "I'm not going anywhere," Nick replied calmly. "Sophia's an adult and will decide for herself how to deal with this." "You broke up my family," Eric suddenly blurted out, and unable to hold back, pushed Nick in the chest. Nick didn't even flinch, but he felt the anger inside him begin to boil. "Eric, calm down." "I'm not going to calm down." And before Nick could say anything, Eric punched him sharply in the face. Nick staggered back but quickly straightened himself, and before anyone could break them up, he punched Eric back. The hospital corridor filled with the sounds of struggle, hits, yanks, the thud as one of them hit the wall. The nurses screamed. Several people rushed to break them up, but both were blinded by rage. And at that very moment, the door to the ward opened. "Dad!" Sophia's weak but surprised voice sounded. Both men froze. Emma stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with terror. Sophia stared at them, her face haggard but her eyes filled with indignation. "Are you crazy?" Nick and Eric finally stepped back from each other, breathing heavily. Eric wiped the blood from his lip, glaring at Nick, who only clenched his jaw. "If you came here because of me, then you can go," Sophia said coldly, looking at both of them. Emma ran to her, supporting her by the shoulders. "Son, you can't worry." "No, Mom, I want to say it now." Her voice was firm, despite her fatigue. She looked at Eric. "Dad, I know you're angry, but you don't get to decide what's right for Mom." Eric lowered his head, his fists still clenched. Sophia turned to Nick. "And you too." Her voice was even. "I don't know you, and I don't want to know yet." Nick nodded, stepping back. "I understand." Silence fell. Sophia took a weak breath. "I just want you all to leave me alone." Emma stroked her hand, feeling her heart ache from everything that was happening. "We'll give you time, dear." Sophia nodded and, without saying a word, more nothing, went back to the room. Emma looked at Eric and Nick again. "Enough, this won't help any of us." Eric glared at Nick again, turned around and left. Nick ran his hand over his face, taking a deep breath. It was a terrible way to meet her father. Emma just shook her head wearily. She knew that everything was still only begins. Sophia gradually was getting better. The doctor said that her condition has stabilized, but her need was yet sprat weeks for full recovery. Emma didn't leave her side, tried to be close, but her daughter kept aloof. She answered briefly, avoided unnecessary conversation, and hardly looked her in the eye. Eric didn't come to the hospital again after the fight with Nick. He only texted Sophia a few times, to which she responded without much enthusiasm. Nick stayed away too. One day, when Emma was sitting by Sophia's bed, her daughter suddenly asked, "Are you happy, Mom?" Emma looked up, surprised by the unexpected question. "Yes," she answered honestly. Sophia looked thoughtfully out the window. "I've thought about this a lot." "And what did you decide?" Sophia sighed. "I still don't understand you," she said, turning to her mother. "I can't accept that you just left and started a life with another man." Emma lowered her head, preparing for the worst. "But," Sophia continued, "maybe I'll be able to understand you someday." Emma looked up. "Son, I don't want you to feel like I chose something over you. You will always be the most important person to me." Sophia nodded as if weighing her words. "Just give me time," she begged. Emma smiled through her tears and squeezed her hand. "How much do you need?" "Recovery and return home." When Sophia was finally discharged, she went to live with Eric. It was her decision, and Emma didn't argue. She understood that her daughter was not yet ready to accept her new life. Nick supported Emma, but he also didn't interfere. He understood that it was a difficult process, and he didn't want to pressure her. Several weeks passed. Sophia didn't call, but she occasionally answered Emma's messages. One evening, as Emma sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset, Nick sat down next to her. "How are you?" he asked. "I don't know," she sighed. "I'm waiting." Nick took her hand. "She'll come back, Emma. She loves you." Emma looked at him and smiled. "And you? What about me? Do you still want to be around after all this chaos?" Nick smiled and, without letting go of her hand, said, "I've been waiting for you for 20 years. Do you think I'm going anywhere now?" Emma laughed through her tears and he kissed her softly. Life is not yet perfect. Sophia still kept her distance. But Emma knew she was on the right track now. And for the first time in many years, she felt like she was where she was supposed to be. A year has passed. Life gradually entered a new rhythm. Emma stayed in her hometown with Nick. She found a job with a local company while he continued to run his auto repair shop. They built their future together, enjoying the peace and warmth that gave them a second chance. But something still remained unfinished. Sophia. She didn't completely forgive, although she occasionally responded to messages. She lived with her father, studied at university, and built her adult life. Emma didn't want to push, but waiting was getting harder and harder. Unexpected visit. One day, as she was returning from work, she saw a familiar figure on the doorstep of her house. "Sophia!" Emma froze, not knowing what to say. "Hello, Mom," said the daughter, crossing her arms over her chest. "Sophie!" Emma barely held back her tears. "Come in." They sat down in the living room and Sophia looked around. "It's cozy here." "Thank you." Emma smiled. "How are you?" "It's normal," Sophia shrugged. "A lot of studying, work." Silence fell. Emma didn't want to be the first to bring up a difficult topic. But Sophia spoke up herself. "I've been thinking a lot." Emma became wary. "And?" "And I realized that you probably did what you thought was right." Emma held her breath. "I can't say I completely understand you yet." Sophia looked at her seriously. "But I know you're not a bad person, and that you love me." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Sophie. I always have." Sophia exhaled. "I just want us to be able to communicate again. I don't want to lose you." Emma couldn't help but hug her daughter carefully. "You never lost me," she whispered. Sophia hugged her too, and this time it was sincere. Finally, a true recovery began between them. Happy ending. Later that evening, as Sophia was about to leave, she noticed Nick approaching the door. She looked at him carefully. "You're the same Nick, right?" He nodded. "Yes." "Well," she frowned slightly, "I still need to get used to the idea." Nick smiled. "I can wait." She nodded and hugged Emma again, saying goodbye. "I'll write to you, Mom." "I'll wait," she replied with a gentle smile. When Sophia left, Emma returned to Nick and snuggled up to him. "It was an important day," she said. "Yes," he agreed, holding her close to him. She inhaled the scent of the evening air, feeling that finally everything in her life was falling into place. She found her love. She brought her daughter back. And this time she will never again let herself lose what she has been searching for so long. Months passed, and everything gradually fell into place. Sophia began to visit Emma more often, at first cautiously, as if testing whether she could really trust her mother again. But over time, these meetings became more natural, warmer. They laughed again, talked about life, and although the pain still remained, their connection was being restored. One day, as they were sitting together in a coffee shop, Sophia suddenly said, "I'm glad you're happy, Mom." Emma almost burst into tears. "Thank you, son." She had been waiting for those words more than anything else. Everything was going well with Nick, too. They learned to live together, enjoying every day that finally belonged only to them. One evening, as they stood on the porch, looking at the starry sky, Nick took her hand in his. "Are you happy, Emma?" She looked at him, at the man she had loved all her life, and smiled. "Yes, Nick, I'm finally where I need to be." He kissed her softly, and at that moment she understood. The past no longer had any power over her. She made her choice. And this time it's the right one. And